one of the problems with the commission is you have people that talk around things in their testimony and not answering the question, or quibbling with words or wordsmithing words. For example, threat to the security of Canada. And when the national security advisor, the prime minister at the time, Jody Thomas, was testifying, and she agreed that with the CSIS director David Vigneault, that there was the triggers to invoke the Emergencies Act. There was no espionage, there was no sabotage, there was no plot to overthrow the government. And then when she was asked about serious violence, the kind that neither the police or an army could manage, she said, well, no, there was continuous violence. And then when she's asked under cross-examination what he's thinking of, he says, well, there were trucks idling, with diesel fumes. There was pollution. She also said, well, there was noise. There were horns honking, which she should have known had stopped for all intents and purposes by the 7th of February, a week before the invocation of the Emergencies Act, on a provincial judge's order, McLean. And then he signaled a week later that he was satisfied that the protesters had abided by his injunction, in which case he said, carry on peacefully protesting.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dialogue Over Division. And I have with me my friend Ray McGinnis. And I'm excited to have Ray McGinnis with us because I really like how Ray deep dives into certain issues. One of the issues is pretty near and dear to my heart and many of yours, is the whole convoy experience, and then the Public Emergency Commission that was established to kind of review all of that. Ray has done this before in a deep dive into the 9/11, and on both of these topics, he's authored a book. So Ray, if you want to give us a little bit of background, and then we could get into the meat of the topics today.
Oh, sure. Okay. So, well, here I am in Vancouver, where I was born, and I taught. I was at one point a Christian educator in the United Church of Canada. Did a bit of similar stuff with the Presbyterian Church, and then I was teaching writing workshops for over 2 decades with grief support groups, with people recovering from injury and illness in healthcare facilities, and people wanting to write memoir, mostly seniors, snapshots for their grandkids, and taking people on nature trails, writing poetry, and then occasionally I'd be with like a first responder group or a bunch of lawyers who wanted to write on the right side of their brain as a professional development experience. So I was doing that happily. Wrote a book called Writing the Sacred about poetry and the Psalms, and writing new poems. And then many years, 20 years after the attacks on September 11th, I knew about a group called the Family Steering Committee for the 9/11 Independent Commission, which was a nonpartisan group of a dozen family members who lost victims in their families on the day of September 11th, and there was not a lot in the press. I mean, there'd be a PBS special with Gail Sheehy about the Jersey girls and so on, but there wasn't a lot of information, certainly up in Canada, about how it was the families that had really spearheaded the effort to insist that the presidency of George W. Bush have an investigation. And the majority of the people on this group of a dozen, representing tens of thousands of families, voted for the sitting Republican president. So they were not out to get him. They just simply wanted a transparent investigation to learn whatever the hard lessons were and make the nation safe. And when I happened upon one of the members, Kristen Breitweiser's husband, Ron, died in the South Tower, and she wrote a memoir called wake-up call, The Political Education of a 9/11 Widow. And when I read that book in 2007, I was surprised how quiet the press up here in Canada had been about the efforts of the families. And as the years rolled on, I finally, had done enough looking at their over 1,000 questions they'd asked the 9/11 Commission to address. And the commissioners, when they first received the questions from the Family Steering Committee, said, "Thank you, to the press. Thank you, families, for these great questions." And then the commission, as it proceeded over the next 18 months, only addressed 9% of the questions, left 70% unaddressed, and then would give kind of a glancing nod to about 20% with no deep dives at all into how to answer those questions. So I decided to write a book chronicling a dozen of the questions the families asked that were never addressed. And I really wrote the book simply to chronicle the story of what a grassroots group of people, in this case family members who lost loved ones, did to try and get accountability and transparency from their government. And knowing that of those dozen, maybe 4 are completely on side with the official story of record regarding what happened, and a number of them think that probably, was government complicity. Others would simply go as far as to say that there was a cover up, a whitewash, and don't, leave a lot of options open regarding. So I really wrote the book more to show people than to tell them what to think, and leave them kind of in the position of being citizens to make up their own minds.
Right. Really interesting. I didn't realize your background too with the uh helping people in health and trauma write things, because it's interesting that you were with the families, and clearly, obviously, there was a lot of unaddressed trauma and health aspects, mental health aspects that they were probably dealing with. And that was, I would suspect, one of the reasons that they're calling for some answers. Did you see a little, like, is that kind of what piqued your interest too? Is um, what was going on with the families on a mental health level, and how there was no outlet for them?
Well, certainly I was interested in that aspect, about their own personal story of law. I mean, how they deal with grief and loss, and also how, I mean, often they're, for the families that didn't want to just leave it alone, they'd be told by family members and friends and work colleagues, "Oh, well, it's been a year or two, just, move on." And they were saying, our way of grieving and coming to terms with what happened is by asking the tough questions and finding out, how to strengthen, the nation by having a vigorous investigation. So I was interested in that. And also, because I was doing a lot of teaching of memoir, I was interested in the personal stories. And so at points in my book, Unanswered Questions, I deal with some of the stories of how each of these dozen people happened to end up, being affected by what happened, and how they ended up being on the Family Steering Committee. So when I wrote that book, that published in 2021, I never thought I would find myself ending up writing another book about another inquiry, this one in Canada.
Right. Well, and there are parallels on that too. It would probably a little different because the family stories were probably a little harder to tease out. I don't know how you got that information with the 9/11, but then anything to do with the protest and the convoy was really public. Like everyone, protesters were posting their thoughts before, during, after the convoy, generally quite a bit. So on that aspect, there was, you were able to kind of watch the evolution as it happened in real time. That would have been quite interesting from the perspective that you came from, I would think.
Yes, well, with the September 11th families, they've been through a lot, to put it mildly, and by the time I was writing my book in the late 2010s and, publishing in 2021, I was able to speak to a number of families, but for the most part, they don't want to start talking about, opening up the Band-Aid of all that they went through talk to a total stranger who's writing a book from another country. So
Right.
most of what I did to write Unanswered Questions was to read, about the interviews that they'd had in papers in Connecticut and New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York for the most part, and watch their testimony at the 9/11 Commission on C-SPAN and other interviews that had happened over the years on PBS and so on. And I did speak to a few people. But what I think would be one of the biggest differences between the 9/11 Commission and the Public Order Emergency Commission in Canada looking into whether the government was justified or not to invoke the Emergencies Act was much as we can talk about the flaws in the major flaws in the POEC, but with the 9/11 Commission, you had the co-chairs. Lee Hamilton was the co-chair for the 9/11 Commission, a longtime insider, had been part of the uh, investigation into Iran-Contra, and he had said way back in the late 80s, early 90s, he looked Oliver North in the face and knew that Oliver North could never lie to him, for example, and he also did not want there to be any public hearings of the
Yeah.
9/11 Commission. He didn't get his way, but he was, he also didn't want to subpoena anybody to get any information from the NSA or the CIA or the FBI, etc. So and as well, the 9/11 Commission didn't look at 91% of the questions the families put to them about key questions for each agency and individual, and and still much of the of what the 9/11 Commission looked at is still really under kind of codes of secrecy, so we don't know all of what they looked at. With the Public Order Emergency Commission, flawed as it was, we have, someone like me who's trying to do a book writing about this, I can look at the transcripts of all 76 witnesses and I can watch the testimony on video. I can freeze frame different documents that were up during the testimonies. And so I can read the report and struggle through the 22,000 pages of it. So it's there. It's a lot easy. It's a lot more accessible. Although there are some similarities, I'll add. With the 9/11 Commission, you'd have 10 commissioners asking a witness like Donald Rumsfeld questions each for 5 minutes they had about. And like there'd be a question like, Mr. Rumsfeld, did you scramble planes to defend the Pentagon on September 11th? And he would answer by saying, did I scramble planes to defend the Pentagon? He'd look up at the ceiling, look at the light fixtures, look at the drapes and so on. And then Tom Keene, the chair of the 9/11 Commission, would bang the gavel and say, time's up, next question.
Wow.
Now, of course, there were also tight time limits for, yourself and Brendan Miller and others and other groups that were asking questions of witnesses on the stand at the POEC. But I think that you had more than 5 minutes, and you'd have, even though you'd want much more, I would argue that the commission should have gone, or the POEC should have gone longer to allow for proper testimony to come forth, and as well other people who were not allowed, like Honorable Brian Peckford, should have been allowed to go on the stand and answer questions and testify.
That's really interesting. I didn't realize with the time constraints in the 9/11 Commission, but yeah, I think we could talk about how wholeheartedly they really wanted to get the information out. One thing I won't defend the Public Order Emergency Commission a lot, but they were under a very tight timeline that they had to release the report within 1 year of invoking the Emergencies Act, which in our final submission said that that's something that should be amended in the Emergencies Act, because that's makes things very difficult, if not impossible, to get the truth out. So that's at least why I understood that there were some time constraints, and I'd love to talk about that in ours. But why, apart from maybe not wanting to get the truth out, do you think that they were even that there were time limits in the 9/11. Like there was no time limit for them to provide the report, was there? Or were they?
There was a time limit. The president finally said, okay, and after a lot of stonewalling and families gathering in Washington, D.C. and protesting and knocking on the doors of every member of Congress and Senate to ask for a commission, there finally was green light to have a 9/11 commission in November of 2002, and then President George W. Bush appointed Dr. Henry Kissinger, to head it up, and the families met with Dr. Kissinger in his suites on, Park Avenue, I think, and he turned up the thermostat to its highest level in the early December of 2002 when they were meeting with him, and the families did this a little bit of background check on him, and I think Lori Van Auken, his husband Kenneth Van Auken had died in the North Tower, asked Dr. Kissinger, Dr. Kissinger, we just want to make sure that you're the right person for the job to head this commission up. We want to make sure you don't have any conflicts of interest, that you don't have any business clients by the name of Bin Laden. And at that point, Dr. Kissinger, who was serving coffee on the coffee table, practically fell out of the sofa, spilled coffee all over, and the women just went into mother mode and ran off to the kitchen to get all kinds of paper towel to clean up the mess. And then the next day he resigned.
Wow,
So,
interesting.
and then
Accountability right there.
and then they had Tom Keene, who had all kinds of ties with consortium that wanted to build a pipeline across Afghanistan, and then they hired Philip Zelikow to be the director of the 9/11 Commission, and they did not learn until the spring of 2004 that there was an outline for what the report would look like when it would be published in the summer of 2004, that was drafted in March of 2003, before the first public hearings happened. And that draft had the headlines and subheadings of all of the chapters of the 9/11 report. And if you want to do a proper investigation, there should be some surprise witnesses that come forth from different agencies, people that you already know. Maybe you think there's nothing surprising, but then they offer up some new information. Then you have to follow where the leads go. But
Yeah.
it was clear to the families that the 9/11 Commission had framed what the report would find in March of 2003, before they would issue their report in the summer of 2004.
Unbelievable. Yeah, I could see something like that happening in the Public Order Emergency Commission. It was, pretty clear that they had an idea of what they wanted to write and what information they were looking at. And yeah, we could talk about the issues that we have there, just the report itself, how it was worded. But yeah, with the time constraints, at least on that aspect, that's the one place that I'll give them a bit of, latitude, because they only had that one year to provide the report, and so it was really time constrained on that way. But it makes it almost impossible to get the full depth of everything, and especially we had the same thing where witnesses were umming and ahhing and talking about electric vehicles for no reason. Chrystia Freeland, for example. So yeah, like that was one of the things, obviously, that was a bit concerning. What would be some of the other, like, notable items that you had an issue with the Public Order Emergency Commission?
Well, I think that one of the problems with the commission is you have you can have people that talk around things in their testimony, and not answering the question, or quibbling with words, or wordsmithing words. For example, threat to the security of Canada, and when the national security advisor, the prime minister at the time, Jody Thomas, was testifying, and she agreed that with the Canadian Security uh, Service CSIS director David Vigneault, that there was, the triggers to invoke the Emergencies Act. There was no espionage, there was no sabotage, there was no plot to overthrow the government. And then when she was asked about serious violence, the kind that neither the police or an army could manage, uh, that she said, well, was there serious violence? She said, well, no, there was continuous violence. And then when she's asked under cross-examination what he's thinking of, he says, well, there were trucks idling, with diesel fumes. There was pollution, and we have pollution in Canada. We've had dozens and dozens and dozens of First Nations reserves without drinkable water for decades. But that's pollution. So we have those things. She also said, well, there was noise. There were horns honking. Which she should have known had stopped for all intents and purposes by the 7th of February, a week before the invocation of the Emergencies Act, on a provincial judge's order, McLean. And then he signaled a week later that he was satisfied that the protesters had abided by his injunction, in which case he said, carry on peacefully protesting. So there was a lot of wordsmithing and also Natalie Duran, who was the deputy clerk of the Privy Council, was asked about threat to the government, and talked about how, well, we had to invoke the Emergencies Act. And she along with Jody Thomas, of one of the people that did recommend to the Prime Minister to go ahead and invoke the Act. She says, well, we had to go ahead and invoke the Act because if we hadn't done that, then there might have been an emergency later on. So,
Yeah.
so
And like with these wordsmithing, to me, when I was watching that, it wasn't even sophisticated or good. It was just really, I don't know if the childish is the right word, but it was playing with these words that are incredibly serious too. Like we're not talking about like a traffic stop violation or something. We're talking about threat to our national security. And then to be wordsmithing something like that is not, I I didn't think that our government would stoop to that level. And when that was happening, it was just like, really? This is the best you got? That was, as a lawyer and as a professional and as a Canadian, I was incredibly disappointed to hear those were the big guns they were pulling out. Wordsmithing words as serious as threat to national security.
and conjuring. When Natalie Drouin was speaking about the reasons for invoking the Emergencies Act, she pointed specifically to, well, there were children at the protest. There were thousands of children, from what I understand, more on the weekends, and with their parents. And she said that the parent protesters were using their children as human shields. And anything that I could see from looking at video footage of the children were in strollers. The children were throwing snowballs with their siblings and family members mostly. They were making snow sculptures. They were sitting in trucks or other vehicles with their parents, having chicken noodle soup, samosas, or hot dogs. They were doing what children do.
Yeah.
And to somehow conflate this kind of language of human shields, as if what was happening in Ottawa at the time was something akin to the Syrian civil war, was just over the top alarmism and irresponsible. And it's way beyond, outside of proportion, disproportionate in the extreme. And it seemed that the groupthink and the peddling of full on political lies about who the protesters were is a real stain in our nation.
Yeah, totally agree. And even again, going back to what they're trying to use as evidence for threat to national security is not children in a protest line, then you have mechanisms to address that, which they were threatening that they were going to bring in child services. Same with traffic violations, you have mechanisms to enforce that. And so all of these things that they're trying to make this uh, big deal about threat to our national security, which is a serious thing. It was just these little itty bitty, very minor breaches or bylaw infractions. And it was just, like I said, as a lawyer, professional, and Canadian, really hard to listen to that. Also, who are these people in the PMO's office? Like, unelected, without credentials, too. The first one you mentioned, Jody Thomas, I don't think she had any experience in enforcement or intelligence. And then the deputy you mentioned, I think she was by professional lawyer. This is who are making decisions on these things. It's like, maybe we should not be listening to these two random ladies who happen to work in the prime minister's office. Maybe that's the problem.
Well, I mean, Jody Thomas, I was there the week that, listening to about 14 people the week of the 14th to 18th of November. And she's very impressive on the stand, very composed and everything. However, all of this aspiring to modernize, and quote, the Emergencies Act, was all part of a narrative about how to understand things, which further is reflected in the report itself when Justice Rouleau, when he comes to the point of saying, there's the last resort is invoking the Emergencies Act, and before that, a government can, if the police have declared a protest a riot and find it unmanageable, neither of which happened in
Yeah.
Ottawa. But if they had and found it unmanageable, then you can call in the army. And Justice Rouleau in his report simply says, well, we know it says in the Emergencies Act the government can call in the army, but times have changed. I mean, there's nothing that's changed except perhaps the army is a little smaller, but it's not. There's nothing to prevent a battalion or whatever to go into a city if it had been required. And I think too, you have, I mean, Janice Charette, I think was the
Yeah.
clerk of the Privy Council, and she was talking about the need to, with the incident response group, the need to get a 360-degree view of what's going on. And at no point did they think, well, let's send some people into the protest to get a firsthand report. I mean, they could have done that if they felt they
Yeah.
needed to with armed bodyguards, if they felt afraid for some reason, unlike Senator Denise Batters, that had never felt conservative Senate member of the Senate, never felt safer in Ottawa in her life. But they didn't do that. And Janice Charette at one point, talking about where she got a lot of her good information, said a lot of her good information was from watching the nightly news.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I was there during the protest and then sat through the Public Order Emergency Commission, and that was really the basis for the final question to Prime Minister Trudeau of when did you become so afraid of your own citizens? Because that's exactly all it took for somebody to go down there. You didn't need armed bodyguards. Even Prime Minister Trudeau, too, would have been able to go there. And I'm sure people would have been, maybe not using the best language, as we see all the time. But generally, Canadians are pretty respectful people and nonviolent. And we saw that with hundreds of thousands of people descended on Ottawa. Crime actually went down, and that's one thing I repeat as much as possible. So it was that's what I couldn't get my head around. What were these elected officials, these bureaucrats, so afraid of that they couldn't have a conversation with these, down to earth Canadians that are maybe not in the same professional, and not even that. It I think what we saw in Ottawa was a lot of people that aren't typically maybe the at home uh, class that works from home. And it was a little bit more of the people that have to go out and work day to day. So I think that was a bit of um, like an affront almost to Ottawa and the people that work there. But otherwise, I just couldn't understand why it was so difficult for those in Ottawa in a position of power to have just a conversation or try to see what's going on, learn from the people that are there.
Well, I have some hunches about why that was.
I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so from the testimony, we learned that I mean the protest out in the West Coast where I live in Vancouver, there were trucks that were leaving uh, the Vancouver area going through the Fraser Valley on the 22nd of January. And by the way, the CBC was reporting that the reason they were kind of slow rolling out of the valley and between Vancouver and White Rock was because they were protesting the conditions of the highway in the
Wow.
province of British Columbia. And then they changed the script the next day and said, "Oh, I guess they're going all the way to Ottawa to protest the vaccine mandates." But never mind. So, but on the 24th of January, when the cabinet was in retreat, there were people in the Privy Council office, people who were connected to uh, uh, Public Safety Minister Marco Mendocino and Bill Blair's office, and they were back and forth with their texts and emails talking about how they wanted to frame the protesters as January 6th North and white supremacists and racists and so on. And then you start having, I think on CTV, the night of the 24th of January, the first of these suggestions about how terrible and despicable these people are that are coming, that are, leading up to the prime minister's, you know, unacceptable fringe minority statements or rehash of that kind of thing,
Yeah.
in the days ahead. And you also have one of the people I think Caroline Williamson, but I'm not sure what the name was, but she was was rehearsing talking points about what the official folks would be saying about the protesters as they arrived. And most arrived on the 29th, but by the 27th of January and in the 25th to 27th January, they're rehearsing their lines, expressing their outrage about the violence of the protesters.
Before they
You know,
even got to Ottawa.
yeah, between the 25th and 27th. So between 2 and 4 days before they arrived, they're already outraged at the violence. And Marco Mendocino is musing on the 27th of January that he bets that, by gosh, I'm going to see, I'm sure, some Nazi flags up on Parliament Hill with this group, and prescient as he must be, there were a Nazi flag or two on Parliament Hill by the 29th or 30th of January.
Yeah. Well, and but so I don't know if that answers my question, so I'm going to press
Oh,
you a little bit more. But one thing I'm just going to say too is while they're making these talking points, the truckers that are working with local police throughout their whole voyage to Ottawa. So it's basically the opposite of some kind of rowdy group that is not law abiding. They're literally working with local police at every level, going as they go through city and province to get into and right into Ottawa, again, working with local police force. So to make those talking points, it's just so disconnected. So I don't like that's where I appreciate and I like that we talked about that, but I don't know if it still answers the question.
I have, yeah, here's what I meant to add to all of that. I think that given the goodwill of the protesters, I mean, who were going to parking spaces on Wellington Street and adjacent streets at the invitation of police that were waving them, come
Yeah.
this way, you park here. Uh, and we're also going to that area. A whole bunch of hundreds of vehicles went to an area out where they were making food and so on, and they all did that willingly. Nobody said no, I'm not going.
Yeah.
And so you have a bunch of, you know, truck drivers and other people. You have, crestfallen soldiers and paramedics and nurses and doctors that
Yeah.
want to have a conversation with the government. I mean, people who were wanting to have a panel with people like Dr. Theresa Tam and the health minister about, where's the beef? What is it? What is it about is the vaccine truly safe and effective? I didn't know at the time, but by January of 2022, on the Public Health Agency of Canada, they'd already conceded that several hundred people had died as a consequence of getting the vaccine. Now, all this time, we haven't been hearing. Usually, when somebody goes to a pharmacy, gets a medical product, and dies, that's a story in a local newspaper or a
Yeah.
local radio station. But
If
all of the
somebody gets an E. coli outbreak, then the whole country is already notified of it and it's being recalled immediately.
Yeah, so they weren't doing that. When
Yeah.
we're up, well, Public Health Agency of Canada by the 4th or 5th of January of 2024. I don't think they've made a report since then. 488 Canadians had died as a consequence of taking the vaccine. And we haven't heard the names of any of those people. So the case for the safety and efficacy of the vaccine was clearly in question. And I do not think that the government, given they knew that they had signed, Anita Anand had signed on the behalf of the government, their contract with Pfizer on the 26th of October of 2020, where it states clearly that the government knows that the pharmaceutical company is saying that they do not know what all the outcomes of taking the vaccine will be on a person-to-person basis. So the whole safe and effective story was a house of cards.
Yeah.
And so they could not afford to have a public panel with a number of scientists and doctors from across the country having a vigorous debate with Dr. Theresa Tam and the health minister, because that might not go very well.
Yeah.
Having a panel about that discussion, if it was allowed to be a fair discussion, would have only increased vaccine hesitancy, as it were. They couldn't have that. They also couldn't afford to have a discussion, even though nowhere in the Emergencies Act does it say that economic ups and downs are a trigger for invoking the Emergencies Act, insofar as they want to have a discussion about the impact of the protests in Ottawa, or the blockade on the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit, and a few other border points across the country having an impact on the economy. They couldn't afford to have a conversation with finance ministers about the impact of the protests on the economy, because then they would have to talk about how their own decisions with lockdowns and everything was causing 120,000 bankruptcies of small businesses a year.
So your thought is that they couldn't afford it politically, so they didn't want to engage in any of the conversation, because from start to finish, anything to do with COVID lockdowns or COVID vaccine mandates, there was no substance to it.
No, there's no substance to it. No child died in Canada of COVID. I mean, maybe somebody who had a bunch of comorbidities, like they were in 4th-stage cancer at the age of 8, might have also died, with COVID, along with the main reason for why they, but there, so the whole argument to vaccinate down to the age of 6 months is highly questionable. And so but so they couldn't afford, and they still to this day will not have a conversation. They simply name call people as anti-vaxxers and disinformation and all of the rest, despite a lot of solid evidence, that's not been the case at all.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to come to a head sooner rather than later, with some of the lawsuits and here and changes in the United States, I believe. But it's interesting how you were saying the things about the vaccine mandates and injections as well, that there just was no substance to it. And then at the same time, kind of, you were also talking about the protest, and there was no substance to invoking the Emergencies Act. And they're so related. That's what I wanted to say too, because um, first off, everyone went there to protest these mandates, and it was, nobody was talking about COVID during the protest. It just went from isolate, lockdown, vaccine mandates. That's all that the news was covering. And then all of a sudden, a ton of people arrive in Ottawa, and the conversation is no longer about COVID, it's about a protest. And so that was one thing. And so, like, that's so interesting how the narrative just switched and changed. And then the one thing I wanted to mention, because I don't know if I mentioned this to you before or if you caught this, but you mentioned that when the truckers were coming to Ottawa, you said that the police were waving them in. My jaw dropped when I heard Chris Barber say, because he was the first one from the west to come in. There were already some truckers from the east that were lined up on Wellington, but he said the police waved them in and then abandoned them.
Oh.
And I just think that's even worse, because you have people that came, if you just think about it for a second, from BC, from Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, never before in Ottawa. And then they've come here in large numbers after driving 4 or 5 days, whatever it was. And then they've been abandoned by the police that have been navigating them, as I mentioned earlier. And so, what are these truckers supposed to do? They just kind of found a place to park. And then that's why it was difficult to manage for the police and for government officials, because right from the start, they mismanaged it. They were incompetent from the very beginning. And it's not something I'm pleased with. So again, there was no substance to it. So when we were hearing, the reasons for invoking the Emergencies Act, it's like, where's the evidence for this? And then thankfully, so I think we could talk about the the commission a little bit more, but what I like to focus on is the federal court decision. Because one thing I would very much agree with you is when you were comparing the 9/11 Commission and the Public Order Emergency Commission, the great thing about the Public Order Emergency Commission, as you mentioned, is that all the evidence was there. It's all available on the internet still. The reports are available. All of the actual hearing evidence is there. So people had an opportunity to see it firsthand. Then when the report came out saying it was justified, but maybe a reasonable person would come out with a different response, which is the most silly report in 22,000 pages, whatever it is. I think, Ray, you might be the only Canadian that read it from start to finish.
Huh.
Um, but, you know, that was helpful. So we saw it. So Canadians knew that didn't sound right after the evidence that they heard themselves, firsthand knowledge. But then we finally got the federal court decision by Justice Mosley, who black and white said they overreached. This went too far. These certain things were illegal. So maybe let's talk about that for a little bit. Were you surprised with Mosley's decision, or did you expect him to find something would be unjustified?
Well, I was grateful for his decision. I didn't expect it, partly because throughout the last numbers of years since the 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and ever since then, uh, 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 case after case has been found on the side of the government, whether it's people who've lost their jobs because of vaccine mandates, time and time again, or doctors like Mark, you know, Trotsy, whether it's a College of Physicians and Surgeons or provincial court or a federal court have often been finding in favor of the government because of judicial notice, where they simply say, we're not going to examine the claims of provincial health officers or federal health or the government's claims regarding the necessity of the mandates because it was quite a time we were all going through, and they must know best. So you whoever the plaintiff is have no basis to object to what's been going on. So in the face of all of that, I was actually quite relieved with his sensible decision to see that the government acted unconstitutionally. And the
Well,
people need to have,
yeah.
for example, when a government goes ahead and starts freezing people's bank accounts, and people have no search warrants, no, 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 no,
Evidence in support of that. The evidence was like CBC articles and CTV articles about the protesters.
yes. So yeah. So the ad hoc nature too of why this person or that person has their bank accounts frozen and this person or that person doesn't. Even people who were not even in the protests had their bank
Yeah.
accounts frozen. So it's the whole and compared to there are people in the world that are involved in human trafficking or uh, you know fentanyl and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they don't seem to get their bank accounts frozen with any kind of
Yeah.
vigorous, reading just in the middle of all of what's going on right now with looming tariff
Yeah.
war, with the U.S. administration here in Canada. There seems to be, like there'll be another huge shipment or find of opioids, and then there's a charge, and then once it goes before a judge, the charges are dropped. So
Yeah.
so all the more miraculous that we have a federal court ruling. And one thing I want to say about the federal court ruling by Mosley, which was appealed within minutes by the government, they hadn't time to read his 200-word decision, is that
Each 200 page.
200-page decision. Yeah, not 200 word. Yeah, 200-page decision. Uh, David Vigneault, of the director of CSIS, had given the government his threat assessment, which was that there was no threat to the security of Canada.
Yeah.
And that was given to cabinet, by the 13th of February. The cabinet knew this, and yet when it came to now, there's something called the Section 58 explanation, which I think means that in the Emergencies Act, there's a Section 58 which says that if a government invokes the Emergencies Act, they have to make a public explanation of what that is. Nowhere in the Section 58 explanation do they mention the CSIS assessment that there was no threat to the security of the country. The Privy Council's invocation memo to the Prime Minister also omits the CSIS threat assessment that there was no threat, or that even after maybe the most serious event with the Coutts blockade of suddenly there's arrests and charges of conspiracy to commit murder, which by the way were found not guilty in Lethbridge court this last summer. But at the time, the RCMP handled it, and people were arrested, and CSIS's threat assessment after those arrests did not change.
Yeah.
There was not suddenly a threat to security of Canada. And when the Prime Minister first spoke to Parliament after the Emergencies Act was invoked in the days following, again, he didn't mention the CSIS threat assessment that there was no threat to security of Canada. We only learned about what the CSIS threat assessment was when we heard David Vigneault on the stand on the 14th of, I think the 14th of November, 2022. And this is really shocking, the purposeful concealing of that really important information.
Well, and he actually again went further at one point, or CSIS did, is they said, do not invoke the Emergencies Act because it will cause more extremist views against the government. And that is why people are here, because they feel there's a government overreach. Don't overreach more or it will cause more problems. And then yet they went ahead with it. Some ladies in the PMO's office telling them, yay, do it. Just use this crazy sledgehammer on these people instead of let's have a conversation. Let's see what we could do here. Let's keep painting these people, our Canadians, our fellow Canadians, as racists and extremists. It's just nonsense. One thing I did want to touch on though, because I didn't catch this until you said this, because when I knew that Justice Mosley was going to make a decision, I was pretty confident that he was going to come out with a very reasonable assessment, which he did, and a decision. And I heard a lot of people say that, but I never caught it until now, is that for me, the reason I knew it was coming is because it was very black and white legal stuff. And that's where I've had a lot of debate with Canadians about how much they expected the judiciary to do about public health mandates and orders and vaccine information and public health issues. So I'm not saying that I'm not defending courts during that time. I think they could have been better or more transparent and definitely not take judicial notice of things that are incredibly controversial. So there, I don't defend them at all. But that was one thing. The COVID whole fiasco and public health issue. But then when it was about the Emergencies Act and seizing of bank accounts and arresting people and the right to protest in the national's capital, I was like, this is not going to be this difficult. And especially because I was so familiar with the evidence too, that I'm like, there is no evidence. There's literally nothing. So for me, the most surprising was the unfortunate decision with the Commissioner Rouleau, which now I just unfortunately say was theater. It was not real professional or legal. It was political, and it was that Canadians shouldn't have paid for something like that. That was unfortunate. So I had faith, at least in what was so obvious to me, that the rule of law was going to survive, that I just couldn't see how it wouldn't. The appeal part makes no sense to me, and I'm really looking forward to see how that goes. I think it's going to stay on with that.
I agree.
So,
I think that I listened to Christine Van Gyn with the Canadian Constitution Foundation doing a rehash, since she was sitting through the February 4th and 5th Federal Court of Appeals, and listening to the lawyers for the Attorney General and all of their argument. I mean, their argument is against the Mosley decision is that a judge has no business asking questions like, was the threshold met for invoking emergency? So I mean, the position of the federal government is that the courts must allow for almost an inerrant, infallible deference to anything that a cabinet might, whatever a cabinet deems an emergency might be, however they want to stretch and reword and wordsmith threat to the security of Canada, Bob's your uncle. And if that's the kind of country we live in, then really, I mean, anything could be. I mean, I remember going to Kenya back in 1990 for an international conference, and reading in the papers that some unfortunate man had been arrested because the police had gone to his home and found a diary where he said something, quote unquote, disrespectful about the Prime Minister of Kenya, and then he was off in jail for 5 years.
yeah.
So I mean, we have lots of examples in history and around the world of more autocratic governments, so we don't want to emulate them.
Well, and it's interesting because I think that's the exact same argument they made on the challenge to the prorogation, is the judge has no business making a determination on whether or not the advice given to the governor general was valid. At least to some extent, that was their argument. And what I think is good though is I think they had a lot of, like I was saying, deference was given by the judiciary. But when you're going to tell the judiciary that you have no business looking at whether or not we're following the law, I think you're going to start to get some pushback. So I always say they've pushed so far, they're exposing their hands so much that I think in the end it's good because people recognize it, Canadian citizens recognize it. I think the judiciary is seeing it a little bit more. So I think in the end that's helpful.
That's what a
I
judicial review is, isn't it?
right.
It's to establish whether or not the government has acted legally.
Well, and then imagine the judiciary after hearing the government lawyers saying you have no business reviewing this. How do you think they're not going to be very pleased to be hearing that? So that's where I'm saying keep pushing it, expose yourselves because you're going to get pushback one day and it's not going to look good on you. So one thing I always and I have to apologize to the Coutts area and those that were arrested there because I was involved in Ottawa and it was a lot. So I often will forget. And you mentioned Coutts, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit as well, because one thing I also found with Coutts is it was really hard to understand was what was going on because there were so many publication bans. So there was not a lot of good information and it was contradictory information a lot of the time. So maybe you could give us kind of uh, an analysis of what you saw happen there with the court system because it seemed like it was different than what was going on in Ottawa.
Well, I think that, I mean, that you have four people who are arrested: Tony Oleanic, Chris Carbert, Chris Lysak, and Chris Carbert and Chris Lysak are schoolhood, friends from, I think, elementary school, and then Jerry Morin. The four had never met together as a group until I think Jerry Morin arrived from, I think he's from Olds, Alberta, and which is north of Calgary. I think on the 9th of February, the four of them are in the area in Coutts at the protest at the same time. And Jerry Morin leaves on the 13th of February to go off and do a electrical job, which he's on his way to, driving west of Calgary to Priddis to do some electrical work for a rancher, I think, on a barn. But in any event, he was on his way, and he wasn't driving back to to Coutts. He's charged. All of them are charged with a variety of weapons offenses and conspiracy to commit murder of police officers. When the first arrests happened of Tony Oleanic and Chris Lysak late evening on the 13th of February, Chris Carbert learns about this, and he's in a trailer. In his reaction, Chris Carbert was feeling under the weather, and his reaction was simply to roll over and continue sleeping and get better, which is not what you think you'd be doing if you were part of a conspiracy to commit murder. Now, and also, I mean, the four are arrested on these charges. They are denied bail, not because none of them had previous convictions. I mean, Chris Carbert had a minor conviction with an altercation with somebody who seemed to pick a fight with him in a bar, but that was when he was just out of high school. Nothing serious. They have clean records, and then they have. They're not denied bail because they're a threat of violence. They're not denied bail because of because they're a flight risk. They're denied bail because if they are let out, they will they may injure public confidence in the judiciary or in the justice system, which is a crazy, it's like let's accuse some people
What
of
does that even mean?
well, it means that if we charge you with a serious crime and then you're let out on bail, we're going to view that as somehow potentially undermining confidence in the judicial system. And yet, there are people who, like in Ontario, who murder a police officer who get out on bail the next day. So there's no reason why. But in any event, there they were, all of them, behind behind bars until the 6th of February of 2024, and all of a sudden, both Jerry Morin and Chris Lysak have all of their original charges in the indictment dropped. Chris Lysak pleads guilty to having a handgun which wasn't properly stored. The Crown accepted his explanation that he had the handgun because he and his daughters had had an incident with a bear the previous fall or summer, and so he'd forgotten he had, so he, but anyway, off he went, and then Jerry Morin pled to conspiracy to traffic firearms. Now he'd been in solitary confinement for many days at a time over the 2 years. And and soon after he was released unconditionally, his lawyer said he was guilty of all charges. So and 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 interestingly, during the Coutts 2 trial that ran for 8 weeks in June and July of 2024 in Lethbridge, the Crown wanted to enter as evidence the charge, the guilty charge for Jerry Morin, that he was conspiring to traffic firearms, but the judge wouldn't allow it. And this is in part because sometimes when people are behind bars for 2 years without bail and off in solitary confinement, they might plead guilty to anything just to be let out.
Yeah.
That wasn't allowed to be part of the evidence for the Crown in their effort to convict Tony Oleanic and Chris Carbert of charges. Uh, so the whole thing about what happened, I think also there's like the Coutts 4, there's the Coutts 2 who finally went to trial. There's also the Coutts 3, which is Marco van Hugenbos, Alec Van Herk, and George Jensen. Marco van Hugenbos, those three were closely involved in working with police to settle things down and wind up the protest once the alarming charges had been issued on the night of the 13th of February into the 14th. And he says that throughout the protest, the RCMP, who he says have long been an agency that's cautious, if they think that any of their officers are in danger, they want to instruct them to pull back so they're out of range of somebody who's a criminal who might kill an officer, because they don't want that.
Uh-uh.
So but Marco van Hugenbos says that at no point was there any instruction from any commanding officer for the RCMP to pull back,
Yeah.
which
Interesting.
suggests that they were not concerned that there were any people who were a threat to the lives of any officer. It seems that there was an effort after the arrests, because the initial charges did not involve conspiracy to commit murder, and then suddenly they were tacked on to the existing weapons charges just immediately prior to the Prime Minister's invocation.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that. And like looking back at it now with hindsight and all of the evidence you have now, I mentioned the Public Order Emergency Commission, I think was completely political and theater. Are you comfortable saying whether or not you think that the Coutts trials were more political than they were about the rule of law?
I mean, I was in the courthouse for several days, and I certainly read the texts from people like Robert Kraychek, who was reporting for Rebel News, and others on what was happening from day to day. I think that the Crown may have been hoping, and I think that there were some, attempts for some plea deals for the four men, before it went to trial, that were, not accepted. So often, if you have charges and you're behind bars, I think some of the figures are like almost 90% of people who are charged with a serious offense will plead to something in order to not have to go to trial.
Mhm.
But the Crown didn't get that from any of them regarding the serious charges, and so it went to trial. And then when the verdict came out, I was there when the first statements of the lawyers of the defendants were made to the judge and the jury. And one of the lawyers, Marilyn Burns for Tony Oleanic, said that there was a lot of politics involved in this trial. Now, the
Mhm.
judge objected to that, as did the other lawyer, Catherine Beck, for Chris Carbert. And maybe it's the decorum of the you don't want to cast aspersions on the process of a trial. But clearly, there were federal players involved in the RCMP that were on the ground in Coutts, and this charge got a lot of press in the worst possible way for the protesters, painting them as, connected to Diagolon, former, veteran Canadian Forces veteran from Afghanistan, Jeremy McKenzie, who has uh, a hand puppet named Philip, who was the vice president of Diagolon, in the hopes of creating a nation consisting of 3 provincial provinces and 26 states, which I'm sure any White House administration wouldn't mind just handing them over, because after all, Diagolon is so strong and mighty. But in any event, the Crown had a lot of huffing and puffing about Diagolon all through pretrial. But during the trial for the Coutts too, they never brought up Diagolon at all. After the jury found that Tony Oleanic and Chris Carbert were not guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, the Crown, while they're waiting for the judge to do sentencing, which usually would happen soon after, that took until I think the 9th of September, from the 2nd of August. The Crown initiated I'm not sure the word was complaint, but they were signaling that they wanted to have a new trial, or challenge the jury's decision. And so this was, I think, a signal to the judge that he better come down with some tough sentencing, or else the Crown is going to appeal whatever his sentencing is.
Yeah.
So people who I've spoken with, who were sitting through the trial for all 8 weeks, and I listened to the judge, who seemed to be fairly even in his comments, objecting once in a while to what the Crown was saying, objecting once in a while to what the defense lawyers were saying. And then when it came to the week of sentencing, it was like a whole new judge was, same person, but a whole new temperament being expressed before the people in the gallery, regarding what he thought. And it was almost as if he was trying to give a sentence based on the jury offering a guilty verdict for a conspiracy to commit murder. So it's hard to know. Nobody knows what was in the minds of the jurors regarding their decisions, and no one will ever know. And no one can know for sure if someone, quote, got to the judge, but something happened so that he flipped his tone with the defendants in the week leading up to the sentencing. And so it's quite odd to me.
Let me let me ask you this way then too, because that was a bit of an unfair question. So sorry. But how, and speaking with the people in the gallery and regular Canadians. Do you think that what you experienced and what you saw and what was portrayed in the media, did that help Canadians trust in the judiciary and Crown prosecutors in Canada or Alberta?
Well, if I mean the CBC and CTV and Global, which were nowhere to be found throughout the Coutts 2 trial, and suddenly showed up during the week of sentencing, uh, gave most alarmist version of what this all meant. uh, for those in the gallery and who were following the court case closely, those who were able to be in pretrial and at the trial itself, I think those are the people who feel most dismayed by the state of the judiciary. And I want to add too that the CBC had an episode of The Fifth Estate, which has long been looked to as a flagship documentary investigative journalist program, which I personally would have said would be a format where I would look to see fair and balanced and proper investigative journalism. But the CBC ran this episode on the Coutts men in mid-November of 2024. And it was as if they were right back almost at the beginning with the initial charges. They were, mentioning that they were claiming that Tony Oleanic was describing fellow co-accused Chris Lysak as a, quote, a sniper, a long-range shooter, and a hitman. I mean, none of that ever ended up in the court. It was never accepted as evidence. And much of, they talk about a bunker that Tony Oleanic had. He had, it was really a root cellar where you have vegetables, for apples and yams and whatever through the winter. They talk about, I mean, the Tony Oleanic also had an additional charge he was convicted of, found guilty of with the jury, which was he had a explosive device for a dangerous purpose. The explosive device in question was, I think, created by his father, who was deceased in 2017. His father was with the Canadian Armed Forces and a peacekeeper in Cyprus, who also worked, as did the son, at times at a stone quarry in southern Alberta. And sometimes when you're working on a stone quarry with a drill to dislodge pieces of stone for flagstones or whatever purposes, a drill gets stuck in the stone wall. And so to dislodge the drill bit, he developed this little, small piece of piping with some regular, easily purchased at a home hardware store gunpowder. And then the drill bit would be released from the stone wall. The father had a permit for the explosive device. And after he died, the son received this along with many other belongings from his father, and was in an attic somewhere on his home in Clare's home, which is 2-hour drive from Coutts. So this explosive device with a dangerous purpose was nowhere near the protests in Coutts. And I think that the technicality, which may, can't know this for sure, but the technicality which may have swayed the jury was that technically Tony Oleanic did not have a new permit for this explosive device. So,
Sounds like a regulatory issue, not so much like a jury issue, but I don't know. Really interesting. Yeah, I wasn't as familiar with all of these things, so thanks for that update. Uh, Incredible what those men had to go through. We have, I think most in Ottawa have already had the most kind of prominent protesters had their sentences and or verdicts already. The only ones still outstanding are the two first in Ottawa, which was Chris Barber and Tamara Leach. I don't know if you've had a chance to follow that. It's amazing to me on this one too that this has lasted the longest. Like I said, it was the first arrest, and now it's taken the longest to get here. I have faith, as I said, with Justice Mosley on the evidence. There's not a lot there. So I'm really interested to see what the judge is going to say in this case. I have faith. What are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I was fortunate to be able to. I was out in Ottawa being interviewed for a documentary that Trish Wood is doing on what's called the trial of Tamara Lich, and I was when I was there, it happened that the on again, off again trial that went for 45 days, and I guess it'll have its 46th day on the 12th of March. Uh, uh, I was there to go for parts of 2 days, and I think that Heather Perkins McVeigh is a very fair judge, and certainly from what I saw of the Crown lawyers and the defense, a lot of what the Crown was putting forward as evidence of, for a guilty was really exonerating both of the defendants. So it was very puzzling to me that they would, or they would try to drill down in some arcane little rabbit hole that didn't really add up to much. And the judge would say, "We've already heard that," or, "What's your point?" I mean, basically. So it seems that if what I saw for 2 days is illustrative of what went on for all 45 days, then I think that we have reason to hope that they will be found not guilty. And I understand from Chris Barber that the Crown is already promising that should they be found not guilty, that as with the Mosley decision, the Crown will immediately appeal the decision if it's a not guilty verdict.
I don't think that that's how the law works, is just to let the audience know, and maybe a little lesson to the Crown attorneys, if they're ever watching, is perhaps you should read the decision first and then make a determination on whether to appeal. That would be the professional way to do it. That would be the responsible way to do it, unless, of course, you're just playing theater and politics. So that's very interesting that that's what they said. So really interesting. Like I said, I just love and appreciate that you do such good deep dives, because we don't see it. We see fluff from the mainstream media and lies, obviously what we heard today. So where can people find your book, and maybe just remind us what it's called
Okay,
again?
okay. So, yeah, so my
There.
book, there it is. So, Unjustified, the Freedom Convoy, the Emergencies Act, and the inquiry that got it wrong. And people can get it, order at their favorite bookstore. If they want to get it online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, and so on for the ebook, and Amazon, and maybe a couple of other options if you want to get an audiobook.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to seeing you again. We'll see what transpires with these final few. And let's keep holding the government to account, because I think that's what you and I are doing, really, investigating and looking at some of the shenanigans that are going on.
Yeah, maybe Eva, you'll write a book called Shenanigans.
Yeah, maybe. Oh, I'll have a lot of material for it, that's for sure. Okay, well, I'm going to keep you for a few more moments for the paid X subscribers. So we're going to stop it here, and then I'll see you in a moment.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.